Buddy. Summer, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is the last class on Islam, so Travis, you can call this one Islam Today. I like that title, Islam Today. We're going to get through several presidential administrations. We'll start with Bill Clinton. And then we'll have to talk about George Bush Jr., President Obama, and then I'll say a few words about the most recent administrations of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Those are not in the lesson, and those are really new history. It is very difficult to say or study history while it's happening. Part of the reason it's very difficult to get good information because there's a lot of interests on the table. It's always easier to study a cadaver when it's dead. Then you can cut it up and pull it apart and find out what's going on in there. But living things don't like you to do that, and that's true of history too. So I'll try to say a few things about Trump and Biden, but I'll try to be cautious about that because those things it's not even history yet. It's just still going on. And we may be in for another Trump administration, whether we like it or not, coming up. All of that's coming through in November. And maybe a little bit about the Israel-Hamas war. Some of you know that Iran attacked Israel just in the last day or so. And that is interesting. That is interesting because we were just talking last week about the Iranian Revolution back in the Carter administration, and how radical Shiite Islam had been exported from Iran. And I had said that class and other classes that I was fairly persuaded Iran was very much behind the Israel-Hamas war. Everybody in Israel knows it, and so this is an important kind of turn of events. But one thing to bear in mind, and then I'll jump right into this lesson, and I got a little teaser for Ezekiel, which will start next week. So those of you who are all Islamed out will shift gears and do something different. I at least am Islamed out at this point. I've gotten through and I've enjoyed it and learned some new things. But it's time to shift gears. So, Bill Clinton, I was in high school when he was president, and I joked last week, everybody talked about what a liberal Democrat he was, and I think, boy, we didn't know what liberalism was when Bill Clinton came into office. I was watching Bill Maher earlier this week. You've probably heard of Bill Maher, and I thought, he sounds really conservative these days. I think he feels like he's been left in the dust by his party. I'm not a big Bill Maher fan, but I like to listen to news and discussion and humor on both sides of the aisle best as I can. So, a big change, though, during the Clinton administration was the internet. That really has changed everything. On so many levels throughout society. Now, the young people growing up haven't lived in a world without internet, and so they know what a huge shift that has created. One of the things, though, unlimited access to ideas, but to create and coordinate non-local movements has enabled small states and groups to become very, very powerful. I do mention here in Clinton's inaugural address, which I regard as very forgettable, he talked mostly about the economy, healthcare, and change. No mention was made of jihad, no mention was made of Islamism or terror, though those things would make themselves felt in the decades that followed. I mention here anytime something in the third world happened, even in Clinton's time, it was passed off as due to racism or poverty. And that's just an ideology. It's really kind of soft Marxism that says that everything that happens in the world is because someone's got more money than someone else or because someone hates some other people group. And that's still kind of how a lot of people in America think. That creates a few problems. The first problem is just that it's false. I consider that a problem, but it creates other practical problems too. The West has become duped into participating in foreign wars without really knowing what's going on over there. And it makes Western powers very easy to deceive. We think that we're sweeping in and saving people from something when we're really helping a group that doesn't really care about us at all. And they set the stage for these things. We think we're liberating one group against another group. And so we have to be very, very cautious of that because the West's psychology is fairly simple to figure out and to manipulate. And people in the East do it quite a bit. So just a thing about that. Now, while the Clinton administration was going on, Osama bin Laden, he's the leader of the Wahhabist Islamic groups that began in Saudi Arabia. And those are Sunni, as opposed to the Iranian group that we'll talk a little bit, those are Shiite. The two major radical groups, the Wahhabists, who are Sunni, and the Iranians, who are Shiite. Osama bin Laden was leading that group already in the Clinton administration. He criticized the royal family in Saudi Arabia because he felt that they were collaborators with the West, and so he was exiled from Saudi Arabia. He relocated to Sudan, and then he and his group, Al-Qaeda, began early attacks against the European Union. They created a base in Morocco, very near the entrance to the West, and a hotel bombing directed against Marines in Yemen in 1992, and during the Clinton administration, first bombing of the World Trade Center in New York in 1993. Most of you know by now that there was an earlier World Trade Center bombing. A lot of people I meet, though, don't even know about that. So I put a footnote on here. That was intended to bring down both towers, kill tens of thousands. On this occasion, they only got 6 people. The men who had done it had been trained in Afghanistan and then came over to America as illegal immigrants. And this is a pattern going back to the 90s when certain states open their borders to immigration. Islamic terrorists enter into those states as posing as immigrants who are in need of help and then set up stations within those countries. That's a real threat. So wherever one stands on the immigration issue right now, that at least is something that has to be taken into account. This is an old strategy. Prior to the attack, they mailed letters to various newspapers indicating their intentions, that the attacks would follow unless the West withdrew its forces from the Middle East and ceased helping Israel. Big, big issue. And that was the first attempt. Bin Laden then, his big plan, though, was to draw America into a long war that would destroy American morale over time and deplete its economy. And in some ways, he had some marginal success with the World Trade Center bombing later. The war against terror, as it was at least called, lasted over 20 years. And was a tremendous drain on American economy. And I don't think the morale in America right now is particularly, I don't know, Everybody feel that the morale in America right now is really solid? I mean, it's a fairly divided country. It's a fairly divided country. Over on page 65, so that first paragraph is talking about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the Wahhabists in some of the early things that they were doing behind the scenes. However, in 1996, that's the year I graduated from high school, he went public. He produced a document called Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. And it's odd that so few people ever even heard of these things or knew that they were going on, because they were very public. It provided a list of grievances against Zionist crusaders, as he called them, as well as religious authorization. He provides religious authorization for the indiscriminate killing of Americans. Americans' lives can be, so think of this as a license to kill, to use a 007. The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. So I shouldn't say that it's allowed. It's actually a moral duty. And that was a very, very important statement. No attention almost from the public, a little bit more given to the government. They tried to have him expelled from Sudan. There was a fundamentalist party known as the Taliban that had just taken over in Afghanistan. And so bin Laden and his al-Qaeda group enter into negotiations with the Taliban then in Afghanistan, and they receive him there. So bin Laden kind of went from Arabia, criticized the royal family. They kicked him into Sudan. After he delivered this big public declaration, he was booted out, and then he moved into Afghanistan. During the administration of Clinton, the bombing of the United States embassies in two countries did get some public attention. They were linked to bin Laden, and some attacks on his places in Sudan and Afghanistan followed. A lot of attention was drawn away from this, though, because while all this was going on was at precisely the time that all the drama around Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky was in the news, and that was far more interesting to most people than Muslim affairs in the Middle East. And so I want to talk a little bit about September 11th, because that is the successful attack on the Twin Towers. Before I do that, let me see if there's any questions or comments about what's going on among these groups. So I want to talk, too, a little bit about how the Muslim community at large reacted to these things, because once these things came into focus, the Muslim community within America and outside had a very mixed response to these events. But within certain parts of America, it sort of telescoped radical Wahhabism under Osama bin Laden as Islam. And if anything, I hope the class has taught that Islam is a very diverse phenomenon over many centuries in many, many different countries. Well, I don't want to, about September 11th, 2001, I had just gotten married. I was in Massachusetts with my wife when that event happened. Everybody remember where they were when that event happened? That's one of the events that you kind of sticks in your memory. We have a teacher at the school, substitute sometimes, and I used to teach his kids named Mr. Tricoli, who was in New York at the time taking a shower when the water at the bottom of the tub began to rumble. He was just a few blocks down from the Twin Towers when they fell. And he tells that story. He's a good storyteller. He tells that story with vivid memory. But this was successful for the Taliban. Page 66, I mentioned some of the specifics of the attack. One against the Capitol, one against the Pentagon, two against the Twin Towers. A few statistical things. 19 men who carried out the attacks were all Al-Qaeda. 15 were from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Egypt, 1 from Lebanon. They hijacked 4 airliners en route to California. 2 of the planes did successfully crash into the World Trade Center. The 3rd crashed into the Pentagon. The 4th in a field in Pennsylvania. The passengers actually resisted the hijackers and managed to crash the plane. 44 passengers died in the Pennsylvania crash. 125 people were killed by the plane that hit the Pentagon. About 3,000 in the planes that hit the Twin Towers. At the time, the World Trade Center towers were the tallest buildings in the world, I think at least at the time, considered one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, dedicated to the cause of promoting peace through trade. And this kind of pushes us into the time of the George W. Bush, G.W. Bush administration. What's going to happen as a result is that Bush will inaugurate a kind of global scale world war on terrorism, specifically focused in Afghanistan, and that'll last for 20 years. And only, was it 3 years ago, 4, that Biden, was it the first year of Biden's administration, I think, that he pulled the troops out of Afghanistan and that our military operations there ended. Any questions or comments about that? I just kind of skimming off the surface of those details. We all lived through them, and they don't seem all that long ago to me. I think what they did do is they brought the Third World and the Muslim conflict in the Third World into the forefront of people's consciousness. Whereas even at the beginning of the Clinton administration, there had been very little discussion about it. And those things had been going on since the end of World War II. One problem that happened during the Bush administration, so he decides to respond with a counterattack, and the war on terror begins, lasting 2001 to 2013. The Afghan war lasts longer than that. He's very careful to point out that the war was not against Islam. It was against terror. And so how things are put in language becomes a very big issue. And George Bush was very careful to insist over and over and over again that Islam was a religion of peace. How many kind of remember that rhetoric? I was always struggled with that. Not all Muslims are, some Muslims are better than their creed. Not all branches of Islam are violent, fundamentalist terrorists. But I do have a hard time in a similar way, just as an umbrella term, saying Islam is a religion of peace. Its founder, Muhammad, was not a man of peace. And the idea of salam, or submission, is the peace that comes after the world has been conquered for Islam. So I always thought that was a bit of PR on George Bush's part, understandably so. It sort of smacked to me. I wasn't alive at the time, but when Truman called our activities over in Korea a police action, it just seemed like... Now, Bush did not go as far as President Obama would a little bit later. Obama specifically went on record saying that these people were not even Muslim, because he says no religion justifies the killing of innocents. So each president has kind of struggled with how to phrase things in English for political purposes. But these people are Muslims, and some branches of Islam are violent. I think that is the truth of the matter. Footnote 101, I want to say a few things about the war in Afghanistan. And when I originally wrote this lesson, it was still going on. So I say that it is the longest military conflict in the history of the United States. 2001 to 2014 is when it officially ended. It began when the demand to hand over Osama bin Laden was rejected by the government of Afghanistan. NATO, the U.S., and the U.K. were the primary players in the war. They had succeeded in getting rid of the Taliban by 2002, in establishing interim government by 2004. But there was ongoing insurgency with periodic attacks from nearby Pakistan, and efforts to stabilize the country led to 10 years of occupation by the United States. All righty. Over on page 67.
Didn't the Russians have a long, drawn-out deal in Afghanistan as well?
Earlier, yes. In that particular case, the Russians were backing the Muslims, and the British were backing their opponents. So, sort of superpowers having proxy wars in the Middle East is an old thing. We're going to get back to Osama bin Laden now. When I was first writing this lesson, the major player was no longer Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia or Shiite Islam in Iran, but ISIS. And so I have a lot of material here about ISIS. Now, during the Trump, I should say I'm anticipating here, at the height of its power, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, had control of several countries, a population of over 12 million people, an army of tens of thousands of soldiers, was a formidable fighting force, and was, during the Trump administration, reduced to lost all of its territories. It had bases in 12 different countries. All of those were lost during the Trump administration. Most of their soldiers died. They were reduced to insurgency. I don't know what their current condition is. There's still remnants of them in Syria and other places, but they have ceased to be the threat that they were. And right now, the big person on the block is, of course, Iran, who is backing the Israel-Hamas war and back at their old tricks. Very controversial was the Iraq War of 2003 to 2011. That happened all the while the war in Afghanistan was going on. It was part of Bush's war against terror program. So while there's war in Afghanistan, is the Iraq War, and this was another thing that really battered American morale and divided the country heavily. People who were skeptical felt that this was just an attempt to get control of foreign oil, access to foreign oil. Those who supported it, of course, there was talk of weapons of mass destruction that were never really found. It did manage to remove Saddam Hussein, so I remember seeing the statue get toppled. But as I always say, remember when you're toppling statues to keep the pedestals. Because there's going to be another statue there sooner or later. It created a power vacuum, and that's what allowed ISIS to come into being. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi began a new strain of al-Qaeda from Iraq shortly after that war took place. There were all these insurgencies going on in Iraq at the time, and nobody knew where they were coming from. But it was eventually traced to a Osama bin Laden-inspired leader. And he was actually different than Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden did not approve of using violence against fellow Muslims. Zarqawi did. And that was a new thing. So Osama bin Laden might have done a number of things, but he wouldn't use his own Muslim people as pawns or harm them in any way. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi would, and so he was a little bit more cutthroat than his predecessor. So, his organization, which will eventually become known as ISIS, had three goals. First, get the West out. Second, to create a new state. And third, to establish a worldwide caliphate. So, what are we doing today, Brain? The same thing we do every day, Pinky. Try to take over the world. So, that's always going to be on the top three. You know Pinky and the Brain, right? Well, these organizations are sort of predictable. At a certain point, everybody get the sense that they're sort of predictable in terms of what their goals are. You get rid of the West, you establish some kind of nascent nation state, and then you try to conquer the world for Islam. Eventually, they moved from the name Al-Qaeda to the Islamic State of Iraq, called ISIS. Now, that raises a question Sister Sharon and I were talking about just before class started. What's the difference between a nation and a state? We're going around the bend about that again. But when these little organizations begin, they have a population, they create a government, and they take over territory. There's a lot of modern political talk about at what point a nation officially becomes a state, when it's recognized by other states in a sort of international community. But that doesn't stop leaders from declaring themselves a state at whatever point they wished, and that's exactly what he did. Eventually, when they take over Syria, they'll expand their name from Isa to ISIS, the last S referring to the state of Syria. President Barack Obama, 2009 to 2013 is his first term. He was raised by non-religious parents. His mom was an agnostic from Hawaii. His father was an atheist from Kenya. So he was very different than the sorts of presidents that Americans have traditionally had. Not just because he was black, but for any number of reasons. He was a different kind of a president. Focused heavily on gun control, health care, abortion, feminism, the environments, and LGBT. And so there becomes the emphasis that's still very much a part of the American climate right now. In foreign affairs, He declared that the global war on terror was over, and he did some active outreach toward Muslims. This was part of what his detractors called his apology campaign, going around and saying sorry to everybody. Troops were declined in Iraq. There was an effort to regather the remnants of ISA while that was going on, so they're trying to regroup. And so with unstable governments, ISIS managed to stir up some trouble. 2010, they had an event called Arab Spring that began in Tunisia, but it was a lot like the year of the revolution back in the 1848. You had in 1848 50 plus attempts at revolution across Western countries. And this was very, very similar. So it's sometimes, this, however, happened among Muslims. In Tunisia, the humiliation and self-immolation of a poor street vendor, he burnt himself to death in public, set off a series of revolutionary reactions. In Tunisia, they brought down the previous regime and replaced it with free democratic elections. So the idea is that maybe throughout the Muslim world, there's going to be a turn toward free democratic forms of society. There were other uprisings not as successful in Algeria, Lebanon, Kuwait, Jordan, Morocco, Iran, Oman, Sudan, Djibouti, Mauritania, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Western Sahara, Bahrain, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya. I just got invited to teach in Egypt that year for YWAM, and my trip was shortly canceled thereafter. So I was on the plane. I was going to Britain or something to teach, and I remember calling Becky from the airport. I didn't have a cell phone at that time, and all the news was going on about the Arab revolutions, the Muslim revolutions going on around the world. New leader of ISIS is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, since his predecessor was no longer. Through terrorist attacks, he was able to provoke a government majority of Shiites to oppress lay minority Sunnis, creating a situation in which the cry for liberation could be answered by ISIS. So he creates a situation of oppression that he can then come in and rescue the people he's just oppressed from. It's an old trick. But people are often duped by this sort of thing. And it also creates incentive for other powers to jump in and help them, since those powers will provide them with money and ammunition so that they can be the rescuers. Strategy worked. It was viewed as a local squabble by the presidential administration. This allowed ISIS to establish a presence in Iraq and then expand into Syria. That's where they'll add the S onto their name. They are very strict in their interpretation of Sharia law. They had a headquarters in Raqqa, and then that's when they rebranded themselves ISIS. Osama bin Laden passes into the background here. He was of course, found and killed during the Obama administration. I've got kind of a footnote on the events surrounding that. I don't know what year that was. Final days of Osama, excuse me. Oops. Osama bin Laden. (2011). That's when the Navy SEALs found his compound and invaded it. Obama's second term saw a lot of political conflict between the three branches of government. I don't go into that, but that conflict continues. Encouraged immigration, withdrew troops, He did not yet think that ISIS was a real threat, or at least if he did, that wasn't really part of the public conversation. ISIS sent soldiers from their capital now in Syria to take as much as a third of the territory of Iraq. Major battles at Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, all in 2014. And he proclaims, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi proclaims that a universal global caliphate is now on the cusp of coming into being. He makes his first public appearance in speech that year. Prior to that, he was always kind of the shadowy man in the background. I mention here this footnote, the Gospel according to Baghdadi, filled with cross-references to the Quran, life and the example of Muhammad. Contains a historic account of the modern fundamentalist movement, tracing its roots back to Osama bin Laden and Zakari. And he notes that they now have satellite organizations in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, in addition to Iraq and Syria. I have a quote from his speech. "You who believe, be careful of your duty to Allah and do not die unless you are Muslim. We send glad tidings to the Islamic Ummah in the midst of the events which were established in and for it. Ascending from a lower level to a higher level is from the graces of Allah Almighty on the jihadi groups. It is a proof for their blessed work. As decline and retreat is a proof for a malady, we seek refuge with Allah. As for the sincere ulama, we ask for your support to the religion, call you to join us. Hasn't the time come to dust your feet with the soil of the land of jihad, to hear the sound of bullets over your head? As for the people, you have experienced dictatorship and injustice for long years. Beware of replacing these years of injustice with the injustice of democracy. Corruption is to be ruled by man-made laws after all these sacrifices. Cloud is about to disappear from the skies of our dear Ummah for the bright sun of Islam to rise, carrying warmth, safety, security, pride, well-being for every Muslim and Muslimah and every boy and girl, because all of them have a right in the treasury of Muslims." That's part of his opening kind of going public speech. Millions of refugees began seeking asylum in other countries, and jihadists began using them as cover to infiltrate countries that had opened their borders. They organized as many as 90 attacks worldwide during the second term of Obama, and were more successful than any other group before them. Those would be the Wahhabists in Arabia and the Shiites in Iran, or the Taliban in Afghanistan. So ISIS was very, very powerful. The apology tour did not work. You might recall during Donald Trump made a very big deal about ISIS during his administration. I think on several occasions. He's always exaggerating, but he said that that was the number one priority of the administration, was to wipe out ISIS. But it is fair to say that ISIS was a significant power at the time. How much Trump and his administration are personally can get credit for Donald Trump's going to take credit for anything that he can. But certainly it was during that administration that these events happened. ISIS at the time had military coalition of 34 countries, a large number of converts, financial support from wealthy donors in countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Syria, and others. And I mention here at the top of page 69, at the time where I finished writing this lesson, they were seeking to, as all these little nations do, they wanted nuclear capability. They wanted to get the bomb. At the time, the U.S., Britain, France, Russia, China, India, North Korea, Israel, and Pakistan were the countries I knew that had nuclear capability. I don't know who has it right now. The only one that was Muslim majority was Pakistan. And I don't know, does Iran claim to have nuclear capability at this time? The, oh, yeah. It's suspected that if they don't have it, they'll have it soon.
Months away from getting the nuclear,
Right now, I'll say a few things, and we got about 15 minutes to just kind of discuss it and then wrap up the class. I wanted to leave at least the last quarter of the class to just quit talking off notes. And during the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, big issues, at least as far as Islam goes, support for Israel in the Middle East, which is still a hot button issue, as opposed, because the countries surrounding Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, would like to wipe Israel out as a state. They don't want the state of Israel in there. And Israel has traditionally enjoyed the help of France, Britain, and America. So that's a hot button issue. America's ongoing alliance with Arabia and the royal family there, and the hostility to Iran continues. That's in the news. And then Muslim people worldwide, both in and outside of America, who fall along the wide spectrum of Muslim belief and practice and are caught up in these events. Yeah.
Couple of things. When the U.S. Embassy was moved to Jerusalem during the Trump administration,
Yes.
that caught a lot of immediate attention. You don't hear so much about it anymore, but what were the, I don't know, what were the effects of that? Was that anything substantial, or?
Well, when Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, that was definitely a rejection of his predecessor, President Obama's approach to this issue.
Right.
And it was a rebooting of America and Israel are in this together kind of approach to the Middle East. That had a big impact in the Muslim world, and it certainly was controversial among Americans. Biden's policy, I don't know if I'm quite sure what it is.
He's quite sure what it is.
Right now, we're technically supporting Israel, which is under attack from Iran, though Biden hasn't always talked like, he's said different things at different times. And so I have a difficult time. He's not as bad as Pope Francis, but I have a hard time knowing what Pope Francis means when he talks. He's such a mercurial figure. When John Paul II was the Pope, or even Benedict, I kind of had a very clear idea of what it was they were doing. But Pope Francis and certainly, I felt that way about Obama, though, too. Certain politicians and religious leaders are very vague and mercurial, and you're not quite sure where they stand. And I don't know what the Biden administration's policy is with Israel. But when Trump moved it to Jerusalem, that was a big deal. Yeah.
it did have an effect in the Muslim world because then the Abraham Accords.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another question. With the diversity in Islam, and especially in the United States, where a fair amount of people are bending over backward to try to favor the parts of Islam What are the odds of this being simply
A trick?
put it bluntly, a trick?
Well, I'm sure that among certain groups it is a trick. There's no doubt about it. That it's a trick among all. There are progressive Muslim groups that are nonviolent, and they're sincere and they're genuine about it. But it is, that's a tricky question.
There is a passage in either the Quran or the Hadith, I can't remember which now off the top of my head, but there's a passage that says basically that Muslims are entitled to lie when it's in the interest of Islam.
Well, that's precedent. So
So it's hard to know, can you trust anything that is said from that?
that's a real conflict, because the life of Muhammad, one of the reasons why we started the class with the life of Muhammad is because he sets the precedent. And the precedent that he sets is consistent with many of the more radical expressions of this religion. To lie and to deceive, to slaughter, to appropriate other people's property. Those are all things that he participated in some degree. So one of the conflicts within the Muslim community is that Muslims who are more peaceable and what people might call progressive are sometimes perceived by what Americans call the radical group, which actually sort of just thinks of themselves as the one true group. And they look at the more progressive groups as kind of like I say from time to time, the way I look at a church, if I drive by and it says, the Ralph Waldo Emerson Church of the Universal Spirit, I drive by a building like that and I have a sarcastic thing in my head that says, those people probably, I have a hard time thinking of that as a Christian group. It's so far afield of traditional Christianity that it just seems a little bit like they've gone all fuzzy. So I don't know that I have a good, as far as the class, to educate ourselves about the Prophet Muhammad and about the movement that he started throughout the Middle Ages all the way up to the modern period in all of its diversity. What does that mean for what countries should do politically with this religious faith? And what does that mean for us as Christians when we encounter Muslim people? How to interact with them? Those are very much case-by-case sorts of situations. I don't know that I have a one-size-fit-all answer to that. There is deception that goes on. That is established. Radical Muslims will use immigration as a way of infiltrating other countries. They will lie in public institutions, say one thing and then do another. And there are forms of violence that there is precedent for in Iran. Not all Muslims participate in that, but a significant number of them do. And I think it's just honest, you have to be honest and say that that's true. That does happen. In some ways, many of these insurgent groups, like the Iranian and the Wahhabists, are continuing to do what the Turks did throughout much of the Middle Ages. And so they're the ultra conservative groups. The wisest man on the planet, if I had an answer to them all. And I'm not the wisest man on the planet. One interesting thing, though, we were discussing is that the current war between Iran and Israel, whatever the fallout may be, could be important. if Israel retaliates and enters into war with Iran, it is likely they will take over the Gaza Strip if they are successful, and that will be gone. And it is likely that they will continue to expand throughout the Middle East. I don't know what the weeks ahead have for all of that. I am interested, though, by the fact that that happened just in the news as we're closing out this class. That is certainly very interesting. I had a number of Muslim friends when I was living on the East Coast, or Massachusetts. A number of Mormon friends and some Muslim friends and some Christian friends and some atheist friends. And I was at a university, so friends of all different sorts. And we had a lot of good conversations. And at least two of the young Muslim men that I knew were very good guys. They were kind. They were thoughtful. They were themselves wrestling with certain parts of their own Muslim faith that they had inherited from the parents and the grandparents. They weren't prepared to reject their Islamic faith. They were definitely wrestling with it. We had a lot of good conversations. So one thing to remember, too, is that a large number of Muslim people, men, women, and children, are trying to live out a relationship with God as they understand God within a tradition that they've been born into. And there's all different levels of education within that tradition, different levels of dependence on their local religious leaders to help them find their way in the world, or their parents. A significant number of them haven't really read the Quran that much that I've met. Some of them are very into it. They're sort of like Christians, you know. A significant number of Christians I meet haven't read that much of the Bible. They get what they get of their religion from their local church, or in the case of many of these Muslim people, their mosque, what they do in their mosque. And so in some cases, large numbers of them may be ignorant of many of the things that we've been discussing in this class. They just don't know that much about them. And so I think on a one-to-one basis, as we enter into relationships with Muslim people, you deal with them where you find them. You find people at a different place and you deal with them. That's not necessarily a statement about what the government policy should be. Governments have to deal with large-scale groups of people, do what they think is best for the country. But I think as Christians, the first thing we try to do is find out where people are at. And I'll say a word about this and we'll see if there's any discussion about it. I find that when I talk with people in a very human way, I always feel like if they're spiritual seekers, that I'm entering into, God is already in a relationship with these people, already speaking to them in His own way, and I'm trying to enter into that conversation and learn as much as I can about them. So that's how I approach it. It's not always the case. Certainly had some students where we had conversations with just hostility, whether they were a hostile atheist or a hostile Muslim, or I've talked with many hostile Christians. You meet hostile people, and so you always have that to deal with. We got a few minutes left. Any comments or ideas we kind of want to put in the air before we wrap this little series up? I've enjoyed it, but it's kind of it's run its course. Yeah.
I don't know if you know the answer to this.
Probably not.
We have all these mosques around, and they have big gatherings, and the Troy police help direct traffic and so on. There's a lot of people involved in some of these big
Yes.
gatherings. What do they actually do in a I mean,
That would
it's not
be-
like you could walk into a church anywhere and sit down and observe, but you can't really do that with a mosque, you're not.
Well, there will be prayers. There will be readings from the Quran or the Hadith or other scriptures. And there will be activities for the kids and other things that people do kind of as a family. It'll be different from mosque to mosque. I don't know beyond that how big the differences are. You know, if you think in terms of, I don't know how different as Christian denominations are different. I would be interested to find that out. You know, if you walked into an Anglican church one Sunday and you walked into a Pentecostal church on another Sunday, that would be a very jarring experience. And then maybe a Baptist church. They all are bound by a similar set of beliefs and practices, but the goings-on in the building could be very different.
But you could at least visit those if you wanted to see.
I don't know. I don't know if
I
you...
don't think it-
Have you ever visited a mosque?
No, yeah.
Okay. What was your experience like?
They separated them in the different, so I did not see them in the service. But they, I think that, I'm assuming they have similar services. They're all prayer letters and that they are directed, they pray in a certain direction. There's a lot of speaking Arabic, I have no idea what they're talking about. It's very solemn.
Didn't have a praise band.
They could have used you on the bass, I told them. There's no praise band, a lot of chanting and recitation.
They do chant, though.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah. There's one guy that does it. And I think they take turns or, various heads of the household that take turns doing there's different times of the day. But this was sort of a field trip, so to speak. So they talked to us afterwards. And again, this was in Dearborn. It was really odd. They were very open about it. And there was a couple younger members that are college-age men that talked to us too. Were attending the University of Michigan. We asked them about their experience there, which they described as a Sodom and Gomorrah. But it was like, very different from this. But it was very well structured. And for example, in here, I'll kind of kid with Pastor Dan. None of that was going on. It was very solemn. And there were rules, and they asked us to abide by them on the way in, and we did.
Now, they were expecting your group. It says kind of a field trip.
We did not just wander in, it was obviously it was arranged several weeks in advance.
Yeah.
And I was like the oldest person there. It seems like that's starting to happen a lot. But there was a college group with me, and they separated the men and women in the different areas. But they allowed the men and women together to ask questions of the men with the charge.
It's my impression you can't normally just wander in. I mean,
I wouldn't try that.
I mean, you could do that with a Baptist church or a
Strict
Lutheran
rules
church.
on what to do, like sit in the back, and you're a mouse in the corner, so to speak. We're giving strict rules, like it's
Yeah.
not, no time to correct jokes and like that. I know we did this, but I think wandering will get some attention. Wandering here would get some attention, but it would be good attention, it's a really friendly church. By wandering, let's say, it was Baptist of Rochester, like at 10 in the morning, there's 400 people in the service, no one even know you were there, right? Not at the times, they would know.
I regret, I never visited or even asked to visit with any of the friends I was mentioning earlier. So I wondered, though, I thought, well, you probably visited.
I'd like to set something up. Obviously, with the upcoming health problems, have kind of put that on hold. But maybe in the fall, set something up as a, church-sponsored field trip to Dearborn. I still have a couple of contacts going there. For the summer. Also, I was kind of worried that maybe Sullivan might show up. That was concern. See, I couldn't make that joke in the mosque, right? But here.
Anybody else ever managed to take a trip to a mosque? It is true that you can't just wander in. Though that's often the case with even certain Orthodox churches or other Middle Eastern, not just Muslims, but religious groups in general from the East are more enclosed. And because I have visited some churches from the East, and they don't exactly come across as warm. And those were churches, so some of that is the culture. Though they're very warm when it comes to family hospitality, but their religious services are a rather different matter. Well, I'm past time, so I want to say a few kind of words and then close with a word of prayer, because this will end out this class. I thought this was good timing to revisit this material. I hope that you are just keeping in touch with what little goes on in the news relevant to these things. Islam is a fast-growing religion. It has a greater presence in America now than it perhaps has ever had. It's very, very diverse. It's very controversial. We as Christians need to know at least a little bit about other religious groups, and when we run into people from within those groups, find ways to reach out to them. As citizens, we may be called to vote on certain very controversial decisions. We want to vote intelligently, what we think will be best for the country. So I hope that this has been kind of educational and interesting for you. It's about time to get back into the Bible, so we'll start Ezekiel next week, and I'm looking forward to that. And let me just close this off with a word of prayer. Lord, we do thank you for these times where we can learn. You ask us to love you with our whole heart, but with our mind as well. And so part of our growth as people is to learn and to grow. So I pray that what we have discussed here will be for our good. Help us to be more wise, to be more alert and circumspect. Help us, though, also to share your love in a way that is not naive, but is still heartfelt and genuine, and after the pattern of our Lord and Savior Christ. And it's in His name we ask. Amen.